Buenos días. Good morning to everybody. Let's go with this. Distinguished guest, with Professor Boots. It's our pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker at this interdisciplinary conference on the population. We are with Professor Michael Boots, who is one of the leading geographers in the UK, specialized in rural geography, in political geography, and territorial change. He graduated from the University of Wales, Lampeter, and obtained his PhD from the University of Bristol. For the last 20-30, since 1996, he has been a member of the Aberystwyth University, being firstly lecturer and later as professor of human geography at that university, and currently holds a personal chair in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. Professor Boots is co-director at the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research, Data and Methods, and also co-director of the Centre of Wales Politics and Society, which brings together researchers from different disciplines to explore issues of politics, society, and place in Wales. We can say that his research focuses on 5 major themes. The first could be the emergence of the global countryside and the reconstruction of rural spaces under the globalization. That could be the first one. Another one could be the politics of the rural areas, including rural movements, community governance, and territorial conflicts. Third, we can talk about civil society participation, the local power, and governance dynamics in rural and semi-rural context. The fourth one could be the territorial inequalities and spatial justice. And finally, the last one could be the restructuring of rural communities, including migration, aging services, and local development. He has led and coordinated several major international projects, including the Global Rural Project, funded by the European Research Council, and also Imagine, another project. Imagine is correct the pronunciation, because it's not with J. Imagine. A project under the Horizon 2020 framework, which explore integrated mechanisms to address territorial inequalities and spatial justice in Europe. His scholarly achievements have been widely recognized. For example, Professor Boots is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, of the Learned Society of Wales, among other distinctions. Today, his lecture is entitled, as we can see, The Politics of the Population, Populism, Spatial Justice, and Uncertain Futures. It is sure that he's going to provide a critical and interesting perspective on the population, which is the central topic of this conference, connecting it with the long-standing research on rural change, migration, spatial justice, and the politics of place. So we are very lucky to have here Professor Michael Boots. Thank you very much for your time, for your knowledge, for your expertise, and feel comfortable. You are at home. And thank you very much again for coming to Zaragoza and share this time, your time, with all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at this very interesting conference. And I think the interdisciplinary nature of this gathering around this very important topic is a real opportunity, and it's good to see this conference grow. My apologies, I can't speak to you in Spanish, but I hope that you will follow what I'm able to say, and we will have opportunity for questions if anything needs clarifying later. I'm going to start with a paradox. And the paradox is that if we look at politics around the world, really, at the moment, it seems that the dominant issue is immigration. And quite often that is described in terms of this country is full, that we don't have space, that our resources, our infrastructure is suffering. And yet, as we know, in Europe at least, the underlying trend is that we are about to enter a period of a steep decrease in the overall population. And indeed, it is only immigration which is keeping the population of Europe growing still at the moment. We also know that the geography of population change is not even, that many regions in Europe, and indeed elsewhere in the world, are already experiencing significant depopulation. And you all know that because that is the whole purpose of this conference. And yet a second paradox is that the parties, the disruptive, populist, far-right parties, which are most vocal in opposing immigration or in demanding controls on immigration, are also perceived, at least, to draw strong support from peripheral, so-called left-behind regions, many of which are experiencing depopulation. So it's these paradoxes, this politics of depopulation that I want to speak about today. I'm going to draw upon another project. I realised I need to update my website to include this project, which is the Rural Spatial Justice Project on rural discontent, spatial justice, and disruptive politics, which is again a 5-year project. We are nearly 2 years into, and this is a mixed methods project. It involves international comparisons between the UK, European Union, and the United States, trying to understand these connections between sense of rural discontent and support for disruptive political parties, what's driving that support, what patterns of that support is, what are the implications of those political support in those rural communities, and perhaps how do we find alternatives to that. And I want particularly to mention that I'm working as part of a team in that, and to mention my postdocs, Emanuele Amo and Conor Judge, who've contributed to some of the research and analysis I will be speaking about today. So there's 3 key issues I want to cover here. The first is depopulation and support for disruptive parties. Second is the politics of population renewal. And then thirdly, the politics of future population change. Start with depopulation and support for disruptive parties. And I want, first of all, to explain what I mean by disruptive parties. Because it's a term we're using in the research we are doing, and we very deliberately have used this terminology as opposed to just talking about populist parties or far-right parties or nationalist parties, because we don't want to get bogged down in the academic debates about what is populist and what isn't, about definitions of where a party lies on the political spectrum. And we also actually want to recognise that if we start by thinking about rural discontent, we don't want to automatically jump to the assumption that that leads to support for right-wing populist parties. You want to see how that might be channeled in other directions as well. So we've used the concept disruptive politics, which we define as political movements and events that disrupt settled political cultures and parties, challenge established leaders and sites of authority, and contribute to societal polarisation. And the parties we categorise this way have policies which are outside the mainstream or the settled consensus. They employ ideology or rhetoric which can be disruptive, such as populist discourses. They may again have certain practices and leadership styles, again, which are outside the norm, kind of tend towards authoritarianism or whatever. And they've also had a surge in support in the last 2 decades. To give you a sense of the kind of parties we're talking about, these are the parties we define as disruptive political parties in Europe. And you'll see there that although perhaps the largest group is on the right, right-wing populist, there are also parties in the left, big tent populists in the centre, as well as far-right extremist parties which aren't really populist in the description, and separatist parties as well. So the analysis I'm going to be presenting in a moment, these are the parties which we've been looking at and including in that analysis. And it's not just Europe, of course. We see examples of disruptive politics in many parts of the world. We can't escape the disruptiveness of Donald Trump in the United States, who I think really embodies that idea of disruption. But think about Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina, and Australia, the One National Party, and then also others like Modi in India, and the rising right wing in Japan. Now, in terms of explanations for the rise of these new disruptive parties, in particular populist movements, they're often associated with so-called left-behind regions. A lot of this came out of the work of André Rodriguez Pose and his idea of the revenge of the places that don't matter. It's places which have been written off, have kind of fighting back by supporting these more disruptive parties. So this is associated with neglect, it's associated with poor public services, it's associated with economic decline, and by extension, it's often associated with depopulation. So my question from this link is, does this mean that there's a link between depopulation and disruptive politics? I want to draw here on a paper by Alvaro Sanchez Garcia and colleagues who did an analysis of this in Spain. He analysed the voting patterns by municipality in national elections over a very long period from 1989 through to 2019, by rate of depopulation and support across all parties. And what they found was that municipalities experiencing depopulation over that long period tended to give higher support for the Partido Popular, especially the smaller communities. But they then argued that the effect of depopulation here was driven by compositional changes, notably the fact that younger people were moving out, leaving an older population, and that older population tended to be more conservative in its politics, and that was reinforcing the voting for conservative parties, rather than it being a response to grievances at the loss of public services or concerns about the vibrancy of the community. However, they also focused more specifically in the period 2011 at the rise of new parties, such as Vox, and they, I think, came to a very interesting conclusion that municipalities on the brink of disappearance, and this is their words, are more likely to give large support for the far-right Vox party. So we have a general trend where the population itself doesn't necessarily seem to make a big difference, but this point where it gets to a critical moment, the suggestion that there is then support for disruptive parties. So we wanted to see whether this holds more broadly across Europe. And what we've done, and I'll present here in the next few slides, is analysis of the 2024 European Parliament elections across Europe, and trying to think, amongst other things, was there a connection to population change and depopulation? So this here shows regional population change from 2015 to 2024, and the vote share for disruptive parties in regions in that election. They vary about whether they're nuts 2 or nuts 3, depending on country and how that fits with the electoral system and the level at which election results are reported. And what you'll see here is that the broad trend line does suggest a connection, higher levels of support in regions with higher levels of population loss, but there's a lot of noise here. It's quite messy, and there's particularly quite a substantial group of regions down in the bottom left-hand corner there, which have some of the highest rates of depopulation in Europe, but still have relatively low levels of support for disruptive parties, particularly in places like Bulgaria and Croatia. So we then thought, let's see if it's less about the absolute depopulation, population change, and more about relative change. So what we've done here is to calculate a difference between population change at the regional level compared to the national population change, the national average. So on the left of those areas where the population is decreasing, more significantly in the region at a national level, on the right of those where the population is increasing above the national level. And again, there's not a clear trend here. There's a trend line suggests some links of those areas which are falling more behind. So the idea that these might be the left behind places, supporting more disruptive parties. But again, a lot of noise in the middle there. We also then looked at where it's not the trend of population itself, but the consequences of those changes which make a difference. So here we looked at votes of disruptive parties and the population aged over 65. If depopulation was leading to older populations, demographic aging in those regions, did that then lead to support there? And here we do again see a trend in the other direction, that the older the population is on average, the more likely those regions are to vote for disruptive parties in broad terms. But again, yet again, a lot of noise in there and some exceptions. And finally, we then looked at the gender gap among young people aged between 20 and 24. And we looked at this because we know two things. We know, firstly, that there appears to be, there's some debate about this, but there appears to be a tendency, particularly amongst young men, to vote for more disruptive parties. And we also know that in many regions, young women are more likely to leave the region than young men, and young men are more likely to be left behind. So we then thought, well, is there a link there? Have you got young men left behind in regions which are depopulating who have a sense of resentment about that, and is that leading to vote for disruptive parties? And once again, here, I think this is probably the clearest trend we've seen so far, is a trend of those which have a higher ratio of young men to young women in those regions are voting more significantly for disruptive parties. Of course, we don't know who exactly is voting in those regions, so it could be nothing to do with it whatsoever, but it's a suggestion there of a trend, which is there. The problem of looking at this across Europe, of course, is that we don't have one political system across Europe. We have a collection of different national systems, and we're therefore not always comparing like to like. So we've broken this down a bit as well, by geography. And one thing that stands out is that there is an east-west difference here. If we look just at the post-socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, those who joined the European Union in 2004 and 2008, actually what we see there is an inverse relationship with depopulation. That actually, to the extent there is a relationship, it seems to be that there's a lower share of vote for disruptive parties in those regions with the highest level of depopulation. Not necessarily what we would expect it. If you look elsewhere, Germany, for example, there does, in broad terms, an association there. That's mainly because the former regions of East Germany both have high levels of support for the AfD, which we're looking at particularly here, the Alliance for Deutschland Party, and also have high levels of depopulation. So it's not necessarily a direct connect between the two. It's perhaps just a kind of environmental factors. And we just then look at some other countries, votes for disruptive right-wing parties in Greece. There is actually seemingly quite a strong relationship with depopulation there. To Spain, to some degree, but again, lots of exceptions. In Spain, you can see there. And then Italy and France have a little bit of relationship, a much shallower trend, which is there. Yet again, though, there's a question of scale here. We're talking about regions here, and within those regions, there could be significant variations in terms of local population change. So finally, we also looked at France down to the commune level. And this is a big blob because there's 30,000 plus data points here. But again, what you get is a trend line which suggests that communes which are losing population, high levels of depopulation, tend to vote perhaps more towards voting here for the Rassemblement National, but a lot of noise and a lot in the middle. If we just looked at the smallest communes, those under 2,000 population, those where actually that impact of depopulation is it's actual depopulation, not just population loss. More critical here, not much difference to that trend, similar thing there, but some broad relationship. Interestingly, actually, in France, there's also other evidence which suggests that this is not just compositional effects, that there is actually a link between loss of services and votes for the Front National or the Rassemblement National more recently. This comes from analysis of the 2014 European elections 10 years earlier, of what was then called the Front National. And you see there that you take comparable communities in those without certain key services like post office and banks and grocers and pharmacies. The Front National is just getting a slightly higher vote in those communities without those services than in those equivalent communities with those services. So, putting all of that together, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there's a broad trend of support for disruptive, especially right-wing parties, increasing with intensity of population loss. But this evidence we've seen here is not conclusive. There's too much noise around that. The effect seems to be stronger in some countries than others, and for some parties than others, and in some cases it's not really evident at all. And that suggests that the implications of depopulation on political views may therefore be shaped by geographical and historical factors. That in some cases we can see the impacts of depopulation on demographic composition. The average population becoming older may reinforce support for conventional parties if its older population are tended to stick with the established parties rather than going to newer parties. So what we can see here is that depopulation itself is not sufficient to explain support for disruptive parties. As Sanchez Garcia themselves write here, inhabitants in depopulated places may see the world of reference around them changing, but this might not be enough to change the way in which they have voted during their lives and start supporting the far right, at least in the short run. On the other hand, when the depopulation situation becomes extreme, the far-right Vox gains high levels of support while the PP obtains negative results. And again, I think we can perhaps generalise that conclusion out more broadly to what we've seen. And that for depopulation to lead support for disruptive parties, certain conditions are required. And this involves a disillusionment with mainstream parties nationally, giving rise to disruptive parties credible options, which are therefore available for people to vote for. And this is my critical point here, that depopulation needs to be viewed through a lens of spatial injustice. So this is a key concept we're using in our research, the idea of spatial justice. And this concept has been bubbling around in geography for a number of years. It has dual roots. On the one hand, in the kind of the Marxist geography of David Harvey, in his book on social justice in the city, where he writes about territorial justice. And on the other hand, in sociology, in the work of Henri Lefebvre and his concept of the right to the city. And these two elements were pulled together by a number of writers during the 1980s and well, since the 1980s onwards, notably Gordon Peary and Ed Soldier, with a focus particularly on urban spatial justice. Most recently, people have started to extend this into rural contexts and talk about rural spatial justice. And the fact that spatial justice as an idea has these multiple roots and trajectories of development has turned it into a multidimensional concept, which is one reason we find it useful. So as I've mapped out here, that we can see 5 elements of spatial justice. Firstly, it can be seen as a mapping of territorial inequalities, reflecting concerns with geographical distribution of resources. Secondly, we can see it as a way of interrogating the political economic production of spatial inequalities, evoking the active reproduction of geographical difference by the state and power elites. Thirdly, research in spatial justice can involve exploration of perceptions of spatial injustice, recognising that inequalities may not only be material, but also perceived, and that can include perceived disparities in the distribution of power. And then we can turn to the Lefebvrean influences and think about spatial justice as analysis of the differentiated ability of individuals and social groups to access and live in certain spaces and to participate in the reproduction of these spaces. And then finally, we can think of spatial justice in normative terms as an articulation for envisioning more just spatial relations and emancipatory politics based on the empowerment of communities. So that's the framework we're using to guide our research in the rural spatial justice project. And I think that's helpful to also think about depopulation in a sense. So firstly, we can think of depopulation as a symptom or an outcome of the uneven distribution of public resources, of infrastructure, of public services. We can also, though, note how depopulation deepens inequalities in the distribution of those public resources, fueling perceptions of unfair treatment. And then thirdly, we can think of depopulation as reflecting a failure to uphold individuals' right to the right of rural residents to live and work in a rural area, and also its right to the rural in terms of its right to shape the future of that rural area. They feel that they're powerless against government decisions and wider trends. And all of this, I think, fuels this sense of spatial injustice amongst residents, particularly in my context in rural regions, which can then be channeled towards the urban core, the idea of an urban elite. And this is where it starts resonating with a populist rhetoric of the people versus the elite, the rural people versus the urban elite. And you can see this discourse being presented in the programmes of disruptive parties, and particularly as they talk about things like depopulation. So here, this is taken from the Vox political programme for 2023, and you see some quite serious. It's no coincidence that rural Spain is becoming empty Spain. Pedro Sanchez's policies have been aimed at demonising the countryside and its way of life, has used climate change as an excuse to impose increasingly harsh obstacles and green taxes on the primary sector and agriculture. As a consequence, this sector, which feeds us in the sort of products that are true national emblems, is condemned to disappear. Rural areas are abandoned. So you can see here this sense of a spatial injustice being articulated, targeting the socialist government in this case, wrapping it up in nationalist language, wrapping it up in populist language, but also here making the connection to depopulation as one of the aspects of that. You find a similar thing in Italy with Lega's political programme for 2022. And here, as I say, the combined effects of these issues are leading to a continuous and inexorable, I can't say that word, depopulation of our country's mountain areas. However, during the pandemic, these mountains have demonstrated their essential value for our country. For too many years, however, there's been much talk and little action. And it goes on about how they will make a difference. So again, picking up on these trends, depopulation become the signal for unevenness of outcomes and treatments and resources, blaming that on of neglect by urban elites, and saying we, as these new populist parties, present the alternative. We will stand up for these communities and these regions. And it's not necessarily just the radical and far right doing that. Again, you will certainly be familiar in Spain about how to have other parties come through. Triela Existe, again, is one model you may be familiar with. Again, considering depopulation as a central problem of that province, but linked to a sense of spatial injustice about the lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of investment in transport and so on. And winning seats in the Cortes General in 2019 gave that some prominence for. In 2023, they fought for part of a wider alliance, the Empty Spain, or more properly the Revolt of Empty Spain electoral platform, and specifically fighting on the issue of depopulation. But once again, presenting this as a consequence of neglect by the traditional political mainstream, as an aspect again of spatial injustice. But so far, really not having much political impact. We can see similar patterns as well also in the United States. where we've begun to think about the election of Donald Trump as contributing to a polarization of America and a polarization between rural and urban, and Trump often again is being seen as drawing a core of support from rural communities which are neglected and left behind, and in some cases again depopulating. However, when we go into the analysis once again, we see similar things to Europe, but actually this is not as clear-cut as the kind of rhetoric often suggests. Indeed, you look at this chart showing population change by county and support for Trump in the last presidential election. There's very little relationship, and the extent there is one, again, it's actually showing slightly lower support for Trump on those as you go down towards greater population loss. So again, not necessarily what we'd expect. But again, perhaps guided by the idea we need to look to the extremes rather than the general pattern, we might want to focus on those counties with the highest levels of population loss, which do spread out, but there perhaps is more of a clustering up to higher support for Trump, and also the counties where Trump really dominated, achieving more than 80% of the vote. And we see that those, again, are spread within those counties, but perhaps a tendency of those being counties where we see population loss. So we can assert perhaps that some of the strongest Trump voting counties tend to be places that are losing population. So the map on the left, the red counties are those which have seen a decrease in population between 2020 and 2018. On the right, the ones that counted in blue are where Trump won over 80% of the vote. And incidentally, you can actually travel all the way from the middle of Texas almost up to the Canadian border without leaving the county where Trump got over the 80% of the vote, over 1,000 kilometres as a road trip if you really want to do that. So we have perhaps a sense that there's some mapping there, but if we then do an analysis to look at what predicts those kind of high level support for Trump, actually depopulation comes out as a fairly weak predictor. And it is things like the economic sector, high levels of mining jobs, high levels of agricultural jobs, it's low levels of employment. Things like that actually are stronger predictors of a county voting by more than 8% for Trump. And what I think this points to is, again, a sense that actually it's not just depopulation, it's a combination of different factors coming together in a sense of spatial injustice. So one of the regions we are looking at in our research where I think we see this is in Appalachia, and particularly here in eastern Kentucky. And this historically was a strong coal mining region, but that mining industry has declined over the last 70 years or so. Over that time, we've seen a fluctuating population, quite a sharp decrease in population in the 1950s and 1960s as the mining industry really started to contract, then levelling off, a kind of increase to population, a bit of recovery at the beginning of this century, and then a fall again over the last 15 years. It's one of the poorest regions of the United States, and it's one which has seen one of the biggest shifts in voting behaviour. So this used to be a core Democratic area, a Democratic stronghold, and it's now one of a Trump heartland. Many of these counties are voting over 80% for Trump. And Ollie Russell-Hochschild, American sociologist, has written about some of this in what she studied at Pike County in Kentucky. And there she kind of links depopulation to other kinds of loss and through to a sense of stolen pride. So one of the people she interviewed, she had written an article in a local newspaper which she quotes about this rapid declining population and how that is projected there, what that means for that particular county. But as she goes on to say, there seems to be three distinct kinds of loss here. The loss of correlated jobs, a reduced value attributed to what one still had, such as heritage, land and ingenuity, and declining value of rural life compared to a rising value of city life, together with the loss of population. And what Hochschild argues is all of this adds up to a loss of pride. That people had losing their pride in place and the pride in themselves because they felt everything in decline, and they felt that pride had been stolen from them by government which wasn't caring, wasn't addressing their needs. And the reason they're voting for Trump is that he's promising them to get their pride back. I want to add another dimension to this, which comes from our observations there, which is about the precarity of place. And this is this memorial in a town called Salyersville to the families, the first European families to settle in the region. And what struck us looking at this is that this settlement occurred in the 1840s and 1850s. And that's, maybe 4 generations back if you're my age. It's relatively recent. And it made us think about the precarity of place. Does place feel more precarious when it's relatively recent founded or settled? It's easy to imagine that this could disappear in a way which is perhaps more difficult for a European village that's been around for centuries. And do family connections to place founders, when the family is still there, as many of those families at Memorial are still in that town, does that make the precarity of place more personal? So there is this heightened sense of spatial injustice. And then what about places in Europe with longer histories of depopulation? Does a long-term depopulation diffuse a sense of spatial injustice because you just become used to it? Is it sudden loss of population provokes feelings of precarity and spatial injustice? And does that lead you to support disruptive parties? But is that then premised on a hope that trends can be reversed, that a place can be saved? So that takes me into the second theme, and these themes are shorter. I'm not going to take as long as these 2 themes to finish up with. The politics of population renewal. A few weeks ago, I was at the meeting of the European Rural Parliament in Scotland, and this is a gathering of over 400 delegates from rural community and civil society groups from 43 countries. And as part of this meeting, we had field trips. And the field trip I was assigned to was called Population Renewal. And as we were waiting to get on the coach, someone said to me, population renewal, you can read that 2 ways. You can either read that as a rejuvenation of the population, bringing up, increasing its number, or you can read it as the replacement of the population. And that's where politics is here. The field trip we went on was very much in the first case, a rejuvenation, a district called the Cabrac on the edge of the Cairngorm Mountains. And this was somewhere which, before the First World War, had a population of over 1,000 people. There's now 70 people left living there. And we visited this trust, the Cabrac Trust, a grassroots initiative, which is trying to rejuvenate that population, creating employment, things like establishing a whiskey distillery, attracting tourism, but also trying to build a sense of place in the community again, reach out to those former community members who've moved away. So in that way, this project exemplified some of the key characteristics of population renewal, which is about retaining the current population, encouraging out-migrants to return, and thirdly, attracting other like-minded migrants to come in and rebuild the population. And this is a common feature, I think, of different types of initiatives. Conventionally, this was done in a top-down way by government. So you take the region in which I live in, Mid Wales. Mid Wales lost a quarter of its population between 1871 and 1961, and by the 1950s, its population was decreasing by 4% a year. That led to a government report to investigate what could be done, and this intervention, which is top-down about creating a development agency, building new houses, building new services, and kind of concentrating much of that in growth pools, such as the aptly named Newtown as a centre for population growth. We saw similar things actually in Appalachia, I was just talking about. The Appalachian Regional Commission set up in the 1960s, which once again built new highways to connect together certain key towns, which would be growth towns, in which new industry was being developed. So the feature again across these was there was an emphasis on settlement rationalisation and industrialisation, building modern houses and factories and services in key towns, connected by new highways, with the emphasis on creating jobs through inward investment by manufacturing, an assumption that the population would start to consolidate in those centres. The legacy, though, has been that this has deepened local inequalities between core towns and peripheral communities. It's bred feelings of spatial injustice and resentment in those smaller communities and a suspicion of government intervention. And that initial industrialisation has died away. It's like manufacturing jobs have been relocated to Southeast Asia or somewhere. And therefore those growth pools have become sites of, again, falling population, high unemployment, sites of support for disruptive political parties, as you see here in Monarchs in France. So more recently, we've had a different approach, an emphasis on bottom-up neo-endogenous development, about using resources within the region to create growth and employment. So this could be argued to be given more control over development to local communities. It could therefore be giving greater spatial justice. But the capacity is lower. These projects are smaller scale. They're not bringing in a big factory. So there's less emphasis on growth and there's fewer jobs created. And what we tend to now have is a pattern in which there is out-migration by young people who don't see the employment opportunities for the kinds of careers they want locally, and then in-migration by retirees and lifestyle migrants. And whether a rural region has a growing population or a decreasing population is really down to the balance between those two dynamics. And indeed, so a lot depends on attracting people back in, and often that's done proactively. I used to like to read the Village magazine in France, where they used to have small ads, classified ads by communities asking, searching for a baker or searching for a postmaster or something to come in, for a doctor to come in and run those local services. And this can make a difference. So I just want to mention here a paper by Ricard Morin-Agret and others on the Lleida Pyrenees in Catalonia. And this area where there's been a reversal of depopulation in most of those communities as a consequence of immigration. And I deliberately use immigration here, not just in migration, because many of the people arriving into these communities were from outside Spain. And that's both through labour migration and lifestyle migration, the latter often connected with entrepreneurship. And Morin-Aglet and his co-writers describe these in-migrants as cosmo villages because they have a cosmopolitan outlook. They're often engaged in entrepreneurial activities which are contributing to the internationalisation of the local economy. And they have very strong pro-environmental views often. They're invested in preserving the local environment, landscape and culture. They've also become increasingly involved in local politics, and often that's seen as a good thing to unlock old inertias, old family feuds which have dominated some of those communities in the past. So what I think we get from this case is a suggestion of population renewal leading to more progressive politics, as opposed to this kind of retreat into more reactionary conservative politics in those communities which are still depopulating. And there's a bit of evidence still again in France. This is from the analysis of communes in France. We see a small trend, again it's not very clear, but there's a little bit of suggestion here of in those very small communities which are starting to increase their population again, of increasing support for things like the Green Party. So again, maybe there's a sense of population renewal linked to progressivism. There's also a dark side here. But what we also see in some places is the empty properties and cheaper house and land prices, which have resulted from depopulation, leading to speculative urban investment, which in turn drives up property prices and forces in beyond the reach of local residents who get pushed out further. So trends of gentrification, second homes, holiday lets. And this is either population displacement or population replacement, depending how you want to view it. And we see in certain regions this being a catalyst for nationalist and separatist parties, as is the case here you see in Wales. More sinister, perhaps, is also the way is when that sense of who is the right kind of in-migrant and who isn't is framed in terms of race and ethnicity. So Newtown was the growth town in tends to change the population of rural Wales and regenerate rural Wales, I talked about earlier. A couple of months ago, there was a far-right rally there, which attracted a couple of hundred people. And I was listening to this from a distance, and what struck me is that what the speakers tended to emphasise was things like the cost of living, problems of small businesses, the plight of farmers, things which were not particularly extreme, they're the mainstream drawing them in. And then suddenly they dive into conspiracy theory and say something like this: the government wants to get rid of farmers from the countryside to make space for immigrants. And this is something I've heard elsewhere. It's a kind of rural version of the great replacement theory. And we can see other examples. It runs through. This is in Italy, in Riese, where the local mayor had actively encouraged immigrants to move into the community, giving abandoned homes to refugees and so on, in order to address depopulation is seen as a positive example by some. And then the Labour leader, who's interior minister at the time, closed it down, ordered expulsion of the refugees from the town. Dismantled the integration model, because and used this again, wrap this in the rhetoric. This is evidence of a conspiracy to replace Italians with migrants. And we can also see perhaps the appeal to farmers who've been protesting across Europe in recent years about tax, about trade policies, about changes to subsidies and so on. But for many of them, there's a feeling that this is an existential crisis, that they're facing being wiped out. And that loss of farmers would be the loss of the countryside, would be more depopulation. And therefore it's unsurprising again, we see far-right parties trying to jump on the back of these farmers' protests, present themselves as the farmers' spokespeople. So again, all these things get wrapped together in the sense of, feeding on that sense of spatial injustice and the fears about depopulation which are linked to that, to exploit support for the far right. So we can think about, again, population renewal in spatial justice. That population renewal policies are often aimed at promoting spatial justice, fairer treatment for these peripheral regions. And in Europe, it's interesting, the EU is currently talking about the right to stay, very language again of justice, which is here. But population renewal does then involve attracting in migrants to rebuild populations. And that leads to political disputes about what migrants are appropriate and who has that right to the rural, with right-wing populism exploiting fears over displacement and marginalisation of existing rural populations, often through peddling conspiracy theories which have no ground in the truth. And that leads me to my final point for the last couple of minutes, around the politics of future population change. And I'll go back to the charts and maps I started with, where the population of Europe is forecast to decrease sharply. But the point is that decrease is not going to be even or felt evenly. The pinch point here will be felt in those communities and regions which are already experiencing depopulation, and where the general decline in the European population pushes those communities to the point of extinction. And that leads us to a question which should be a key political question and isn't quite there yet, which is, should depopulating towns and villages be allowed to die? 20 years ago, this was suggested in Australia, became a key political debate there. It's not quite got to that point yet. Still, much of the political emphasis here is, how do we fight back against depopulation? How can we change it? How do we resist it? Not the question of, well, why do we want to do that? And is that a good use of public resource? Is it an appropriate way to go into the future? I'm not coming on one side or the other here. I'm saying there's a political debate there, which we aren't yet having, but I can guarantee we will be having within the next decade. And it's been done elsewhere. Canada in the 1950s in Newfoundland, they closed down a lot of old small outports, old fishing communities. In some cases, the houses were physically moved across water, across ice, to a different location. So places have done it. Again, perhaps it was easier to do in those places like North America, where these communities had not been around for very long. Can we really do this in Europe? Close down villages which had been there 1,000 years or so? Allow them to die? Actively force them to die, as in Newfoundland, requiring people to move out? And if we don't want to do that, what's the alternative? Is it immigration? Can immigration save towns and villages from dying? Pro-immigration advocates argue we need immigration at a national scale to maintain the workforce, to pay taxes, to pay pension contributions. But that's fine. But what incentives are there for those immigrants to settle in depopulating areas? As I started with, the disruptive political parties that seek to exploit spatial injustice are also those who tend to be anti-immigration and will fight against this issue. And also, it's arguably only a temporary issue, because by the end of this century, the only part of the world still focused to be growing its population is Africa. There's not actually an inexhaustible supply of immigrants who can move into rural Spain and rural Europe to replace a loss of population. So without immigration, what's the alternative? Well, it's increasing the birth rate amongst native residents. And that's why we're seeing pro-natalist policies increasingly advocated by populist and right-wing politicians. But how will that help depopulated communities where the younger population have already left? The family age people aren't there. So is pro-natalism going to have a difference? But again, you see these different ideas being knitted together in the platforms of parties such as Vox here. On the one hand, thinking about this idea of the displacement of the population through immigration, and then the counter set of policies to promote birth rates. And then finally, there's the politics of what happens to the countryside, or indeed other regions, once it's been emptied of people, once it's been depopulated. In the context of the climate crisis, there's numerous plans out there for land repurpose, for renewable energy, for carbon sequestration, for carbon offsetting, for afforestation, for biodiversity recovery and rewilding. But at the same time, we can see loads of protests against that. And those protests are often driven by a fear that once that land is converted to these uses, it's not going to go back to farmland. It's not going to go back to uses which are supporting a workforce and a population. And fears that it's not going to be at the point where it's not just about making use of abandoned land, but actually actively forcing the population out of those rural areas in order to make way for these activities. So once again, disruptive parties are exploiting this and promoting these sets of fears and concerns. And perhaps we shouldn't be too harsh on those communities which end up voting that way. It's not surprising that communities faced with declining population and the prospect of disappearing turn to populism, which offers rural voters hope that the future can be changed through what might be called a nostalgic futurism. The idea of a vision of the future can be changed by returning back to an idealized past. And in depopulating regions, it's an idealized and often mythical past when communities were thriving before people started to leave. So I'm not going to end with conclusions, but with a dilemma, because I don't really have the answers here. But I think we need to think about, is it possible to address the problem of depopulation in a spatially just way? Can a right to stay and a right to the rural be financially and environmentally sustainable? Can sufficient land be freed for climate adaptation and mitigation uses without displacement of depopulation? And who should get to decide about those future rural land uses? Can the closure of villages and towns be managed in a way that is seen as inclusive and fair and not regarded as just being imposed on the outside? And if we do just push those things through, if the grievances of people in depopulating regions are ignored, will it fuel even greater support for disruptive parties? And is that nostalgic futurism of populism just a pure fantasy? Or is there something there that perhaps can be channeled into something more practical and productive and away from the polarizing positions they have? I'll finish there. Gracias. Thank you.
Many thanks, Michael, for this suggestive intervention, talking at the first part about this link connection with the political aspects, the link, the population, politics, but later also pointing out other aspects, different initiatives and thematics. I'm very happy with one slide that Michael used about the pronatalist, because many times we are forgetting, that the population problem is not, we are talking all the day, all the time about population coming, immigrants, people coming, but where is the other part? Where is, because we are not talking about natalist. So this is the second part, no, of the equation, no. So I'm very happy when we consider, no, this. We don't forget this aspect. The intervention is very suggestive. I have some questions, but maybe we can open the floor to you. With questions, yes, we have here, please. Yeah, because of the streaming also, no? For the people who is at home.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Petra Benjay from the Spanish Research Council. Your talk was super interesting. I actually saw your talk in Riga also. It was really nice also. I have two questions. One question is a bit of a methodological one, because you normally use population loss and you calculate population loss in a kind of narrow time frame. And my question was, did you ever consider to having a longer time span? Because of course, like, you can have stagnant population that wouldn't appear as losing population, but there are tiny villages anyway. And the other question would be, when you have explored the rise of these parties, some of these parties were emerging. Now, some of them are in government. Have you explored the intention of voting intention after these parties have actually governed? Because I know from our context, we work in rural areas, especially in farmer generational renewal, and a lot of the farming youth are really well in this line of work. But now with the new policy framework, the new budgetary framework, where common agricultural policy is being cut down, there's kind of starting to be some discontent also with these parties, because they are not really in practice supporting farmers or rural areas. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for those questions. And I think first on the methodology, yes, absolutely right. I think if we were to develop this and publish it, we want to look at more. We kind of ran out of time to do more with the analysis before this talk, and we often were constrained to some degree about the data sets we were accessing. So, for example, Eurostat has it's year nuts-free level population goes back to 2015. I think this is why we took that time scale. It will be possible to get earlier data, but it will take more effort to get that. So I think we want to look at that, because I think there's all that sense of change. So longer term, so I think that sense of long-term depopulation change will be important, but also this sense of order periods in which there's a sudden change. I think ties into the idea that maybe it's what seems to be a crisis point is what forces the political change. So I think there's more to be explored through that. You're absolutely right. And then secondly, in terms of the going to government, we are, one of the reasons we're doing this research, we're looking at not just one election, but support since the beginning of a century, so we can get that sense of a pattern over time, and including parties going to the government to come out of that. To be honest, it's a bit different. It varies between parties and countries, but I think certainly you do see evidence in some cases that these parties are built on a rhetoric of attacking the mainstream, whatever, and therefore the government, and they aren't seen to deliver. There is then, disillusionment. And interesting, we're just doing some work in Britain in a moment in a county called Lincolnshire, which is an area which elected a Reform MP from the far right last year, and lots of, again, from interviews of what we're expecting in terms of anti-London viewpoints of rural being neglected and deleted known for us. But they're also very critical of this Reform MP, who they feel, well, he doesn't live here, he's never turned up, whatever. And I think there's a really interesting question if those parties themselves either aren't seen to deliver or become seen as part of the elites themselves. What happens next? Where does this resentment go after that? And that's one of the interesting questions. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Michael. My name is Julia Hilewicz. I'm University of Groningen. So actually, what you were saying about should we let these places die or something, like you had this kind of question, almost philosophical, made me think of the work of my PhD student. We presented this morning, where he showed in 1957 in the Netherlands they were having exactly the same questions, which is I think was happening across Europe, because I know from Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine was the same question, and the answer to that question was yeah, that's fine. The rural areas, they will decline, and the cities will grow. And I think now we kind of, the tide turned a bit.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you know when will be the turning point, and obviously that probably will be varied. And the other question may be more related to the political parties, is when do you think they start, so I feel that they are making the depopulation a problem. When do they start doing this? And if you have an idea, like, is it post the crisis, post like economic crisis, or is it before? And any reflections would be interesting to hear.
Really interesting questions. And I think this is also why this historical perspective is important, and why, again, this interdisciplinary approach is interesting. So I think I think you're actually right that in the kind of the post-war period of the 1950s, there was, in many countries, a sense of this debate was there. I mentioned examples in Canada and Newfoundland, but I think the variation in Europe was that model I talked about of this, at a regional scale, this top-down model, which then was about, well, we can rejuvenate this area, we can get population growing in this region, but we do that by investing in a central town, and by implication, we want people to move there, and by implication, that means for smaller villages will be left to wither away and die. And I think that was the kind of model at that time. What I think happened is is the increasing individualism we saw perhaps in the 1980s, 1990s. We had in many countries, including Britain, an increased emphasis on property ownership and so on. And I think there's a cultural change then, which was, we have these rights. People were not going to, I think people became less prepared to be told by government, you can't live here, you're going to move. And that sense that we've got a right to be here and the government should be responding to that has changed. So I think that was a shift which happened, which makes it more difficult to have that debate now. And then in the parties, I don't know, we haven't looked at the great deal. The only one we have got, a lot of these parties are obviously quite recent as well, so they often only emerged post the economic crisis. But Lega, for example, we do have longer term. They shifted before, when they first came up, they were very much a regionalist separatist party. It's as they then expanded to try and become a national party for Italy, that's when they really started picking up on these ideas of spatial injustice and depopulation was picked up in that. So it's all tied into the political strategy.
Hi, good morning, Michael. Thank you for your presentation. It was deeply inspiring. So I have a quick question from your first part of your presentation, and it wonders about the idea of the rural areas losing their pride, I would say. So if rural areas lose their pride, could that translate to a loss in voting interest? If they lose voting interest, could that mean that those who vote and those who vote to the far right, could that translate to that increase on voting to the far right? Thank you.
Again, a very interesting question. And that sense of, this argument of pride is Ali Hochschild's idea about this is partly what we're seeing in these regions was what were very proud communities and self-sufficient communities, that pride's been really taken out of them by the experience of economic loss. They don't feel proud about the industry, the communities are going and no one's helping them. So I think that she links that pride into a sense of resentment. I think that sense of that, does that lead to not voting at all, and a loss of civic pride, if you like, in that way. One of the, at present, the analysis seems to suggest that a lot of these disruptive parties are actually picking up non-voters. So it's people who hadn't voted before are voting for these parties, rather than necessarily people switching from other parties to do so. So there's almost a counter going to what you're suggesting going on there. But I then think that also picks into the previous question about what happens if people then become disillusioned with these parties, and the likelihood is just won't vote at all. And so maybe there's a bit of an up and down pattern there.
Mariluz, aquí Javier en primera fila.
¿Está abierto?
Sí, está abierto.
Sí. Hi. Mike, thank you very much for your so pretty illustrative presentation. I think you have a comprehensive knowledge, perhaps much more than more people in Spain, about our situation. I have just two questions. The first one is related to the emphasis of the settlement rationalization you talked. You connected with industrialization, but and you talk also on the key towns and growth poles, and that will be very nice if it is possible in many places. And connected with that, you talk on. You put a question: should depopulating towns and villages be allowed to die? This is a really very nice question. Obviously, I think all of us will agree that we don't allow them to die. But the situation is that the smaller, and most of the smaller villages, for example, in Spain, the situation is really critical. And for example, if we try to help through immigrants, the tendency is that immigrants used to come not to the smaller villages, but medium villages, and they are not so stable living in these areas that we will like to be. So it is really difficult, and many people, scholars, said that, of course, we can't allow these municipalities to die, these villages, but we have to assist them in the process to die, because this is probably an not stoppable process. So what do you think about that in the situation in Spain? And the second question is more practical. If you have here the Ministry of Demographic Challenge, what couple of actions can you advise her about how to afford depopulation from public policies? What should be the first idea or for a comprehensive strategies for them? From the practical political side, and also thinking in the sense to afford this increase of fire rights vote that you show that we have so important in some important way in Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. And I think in terms of the, I think it's a really interesting question about, are villages allowed to die? Do we manage and do so? I think probably what is not sustainable is just keeping villages and towns on life support indefinitely, and that I think is often where we are at present. In kind of, you're doing enough to try and keep them going, and that really then raises questions about sustainability and finance to do that. I think I struck in the previous panel, and one of the things Mike said about the approach of the Scottish government, which is we're not going to set some arbitrary date in the past and say we'll go back to that level of population. It's actually about managing policies which can hopefully allow these communities to become sustainable in some way and viable, but that may still be at a much lower population than it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And I think that kind of mindset is more that thinking, and then that needs a much more proactive and imaginative sense of set of ideas and policies about what does this look like, what does this nature of this community look like, and what role do immigrants have in that, and actually how do you deal with perhaps a more turnover. And that, I think, is what leads into the second question you asked. And I don't know I've got enough knowledge to advise the Spanish ministry on this, but just a couple of reflections, certainly from my experience in Wales. One is that I think the most important, the critical thing, I think, is about giving opportunities for young people in communities, particularly rural communities, who want to stay. And that seems to be the bit we can do something about. And we did a survey of young people in rural Wales a few years ago, and that's from a whole group who want to leave. They're going to leave anyway. Some will move back later in life, but they want to go away and have experience of living in the big city. a very small group who plan to stay, like living there, and they don't feel a need to move because they've got a job locally. But there's about 40% of them were young people who said, my preference would be to continue living in my local area, but I feel I need to move away for employment or training. And those are the ones who you need to focus on and think about, well, what kinds of jobs are they looking at? How do we develop that area? How do we invest about making sure that there's housing available, there's the appropriate training about? It's trying to keep that group there. So I'd say focus on that particular group. And then the second thing I'd give as advice comes back to my point is we need to avoid these things becoming confrontational and polarizing. So we need to have a serious conversation with communities about the future. What is it about their place they want to respect and maintain? How do they see their community growing? And involve them in that conversation and involve them in coming up with solutions rather than us trying to impose that from the outside.
In Spain, it is true that now we have a generation of young people that obviously they pretend to stay. I see this in the Pyrenees. I'm coming from the Pyrenees, so in many places now this generation, now they have in the 20s. So I think the key is to have qualified jobs. I think this is one of the main challenges, because the people go to the university, they come back, they would like to come back and stay, but they have to leave finally because they cannot work in one qualified job. I don't know, what do you think, but as far as I see, that should be one of the main strategies to fix population, offering labor opportunities for qualified people. More questions?
Yeah.
Anyone? Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for your inspiring presentation. My name is Camila from the University of Barcelona, and I was wondering if you could please develop a little bit further on your use of the concept of disruptive politics. I have some doubts about mixing together far-right and left-wing options, as you did, especially when you think about the local declinations, no, and the instantiations at the local level. It is curious, for example, from the local perspective, to mix together Junts in Catalonia and Vox as disruptive politics. And in this sense, perhaps a use of within the PP would be a much better option when we are thinking about disruptive politics. So I would like to hear more about this and how you face the risk of building a concept that could establish a dichotomy between disruptive politics and hegemonic or non-disruptive or order, parties of order, and how this dichotomy could be legitimate or actually how to avoid it.
Yes, thank you. And I think you're right, and it's a key challenge. I think we've deliberately wanted to come up with a term which is broad and which allowed us to think about the key thing being this departure from the mainstream. And I've seen other places people use terms like anti-system parties on both the right and left. People have talked about this being an anti-incumbent vote. It's simply trying to capture these different areas. What I'm not doing is suggesting that the kind of far-right parties and disruptive progressive parties on the left are the same thing. I'll try and do that. This is not about a moral equivalence. There are key differences. But I think by coming up with a term to define our research area, then allows us to explore those differences. So I think it's actually one of the key things I think from the analysis we're doing, by starting to the point about what's the contribution of rural discontent here, is it has drawn out differences between right and left-wing disruptive parties. And that, as we perhaps would anticipate, the right-wing disruptive parties, in most cases, have a higher level of support in rural areas. The left-wing disruptive parties, in most cases, have a higher level of support in urban areas. But not always, and there are exceptions, and that's why it's interesting. I think what it also, the other thing which kind of comes from that is then thinking about the consequences of that behaviour. We then start to think about, well, why are people going for one party or the other? In what cases? So actually, some of the most interesting examples you will want to follow through in our research is where we have rural areas who are feel marginalised, maybe a declining population, and are opting to vote for more radical left-wing alternatives or for progressive separatist parties and things like this, rather than for the far right, and understand why are they making that difference and what can we learn from that in terms of building a more consensual politics. So it's not about treating them all as being the same, it's creating a framework in which we can explore some of those differences rather than saying we're just going to focus on this group and exclude looking at other group altogether. And there's an address at the Substack, there's a article on there where we discuss our definition of disruptive parties and how we came up with it, and it's these questions in more detail.
Okay, more questions? Come on, you have the opportunity. No more? Incluso en español? Yes, one more. Thank you.
And it's not a question, it's more a commentary, because we're talking a lot about letting villages die and about, you know, maybe even like removing the villages that are dying and moving them somewhere else. And nobody's talking about the limits to growth of cities. And I think like that's also a key question, and we're focused on depopulation. Of course, this is a depopulation conference, but a lot of the discourse on how to solve this problem is looking at the local, like, yeah, of course, the depopulated villages, but I find it a bit contradictory that, I don't know, yeah, a lot of the European funds go to cities and nobody's questioning kind of that, no? So I don't know if someone has a broader reflection on that.
I'm now just in response to that. I think you're right. I think that's another part of the debate and discussion we're not having. I think it's because, and certainly we think about this in the terms of our future environmental sustainability and what that might mean. I did the Imagine project, which was mentioned at the beginning introduction. We did some scenarios about future scenarios for Europe and what they meant for territorial inequalities and spatial justice. One of those scenarios kind of reflected part of the things I was saying here, about you have this, it's a city, there's increased centralization in order to deal with these problems, and part of that has involved this kind of repurposing of land and concentration of population, releasing these rural areas for these other land uses. Another scenario we had was a kind of one of the dissipation of populations, that people felt that urban areas were no longer pleasant places to live in a hotter climate, and fears of pandemics and so on. And then we got a rejuvenation of rural areas, which we then saw actually leading to a kind of fragmentation of politics around that. So it could go either way. I think an obstacle to that debate is actually the rise of these right-wing disruptive parties, because so much of their rhetoric is being framed as an attack on cities and as an attack on the urban, but it perhaps prevents more progressive voices to themselves become critical of the urban model.
Okay, any other question? No? So we can finish. Thank you very much, Michael, for your knowledge and your time. Don't move, please, 5 minutes more, because va a haber one presentation of a book from the CEDAR with Vicente. Thank you, Michael.
Intentaremos que no muráis de hambre, son solo 5 minutos y vamos a aprovechar para una sorpresa que no estaba en el programa, que es presentar un libro que en estos momentos acaba de aparecer los primeros ejemplares y que para nosotros es muy grato. El pendrive.